Jenkins, who's joining us today from the University of Southern California. Dr. Jenkins is the Provost Professor of Journalism, Cinema, East Asian Studies, Education, Underwater Basket Weaving. Not yet. He's working on that one at the University of Southern California and has written 20-plus books on pop culture and media. And he's going to talk to us today about what the civic imagination concept is. I'll turn it over to you, Henry.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, first of all, good to be back in the South. I grew up in Atlanta and Clayton, Georgia, so not so far down the road. And since I come with California attached to my name, and that builds a certain wrinkles in some of this region, I want to make it clear that I'm actually from here, not from Kentucky, but at least from the Appalachian region, and I'm really happy to be doing work that reconnects my roots, both here and in Georgia. So I'm going to talk about another South, the global South, to get us started. Went recently to this film, Jawan, which was playing at the Los Angeles version of the Alamo Drafthouse. It's over the last month has become the largest, most successful film in the world. Probably without most people in this room being aware of it at all. Comes from India. It has dominated Asia. It has dominated many other parts of the world. And it is a deeply political film, but at the same time, a deeply popular film, right? It's a film that is, like many Bollywood films, mixes a range of genres. It is definitely a blockbuster action film. It has very strong images of female empowerment, lots of women with machine guns, escaped convicts. It has all the elements of a good Dumas novel with secret identities, long-lost twins. It has elements of Robin Hood in it. It's a modern-day Robin Hood who robs the rich and powerful and distributes the money to farmers across India who owe debt to the banks, and he frees them of their debt. He fixes the healthcare system in India. And the idea is he fights for social justice, but at the same time, he's confronting a state of even bigger crooks, right? He may be a thief, but the people in charge of the government are crooks and incompetent crooks who are stealing from the poor and giving to the rich. And so he reverses that over the course of this film. And it ends up being a really powerful critique of Modi's India, critique of his own government in a society that probably would not have allowed for quite as direct a statement of its politics, but do recognize it when you throw on musical numbers and action scenes and lots of pulpy, 19th century literary conventions. I start there because it's an example of what we're calling the civic imagination. How does this film invite us to imagine a different future for India, an India where the government works for the people and money is spent to help the poor, not the rich, become richer? That's the kind of question it invites us to ask, and it's told from a Muslim filmmakers working in a dominant Hindu country where Hindu nationalism has become a central part of everyday life there. Let me shift to a different example. Where did I go? Here we go. I spent 7 weeks this summer in Shanghai and in China. One of the few white Westerners I saw my entire time in that country. And part of what I was there to study was the intersection of Japan, China, Korea, and the way that young people in China were embracing popular narratives from elsewhere around the world. So a fan in Japan would be called an otaku. So these are cosplayers and card game players at various malls around Shanghai who are embracing Japanese popular culture despite the pretty complex geopolitical history of Japan's relation with China. Here in the heart of Shanghai is an 80-foot tall purple statue of a giant robot from Evangeline that has become a kind of homeland for these otaku fans who show up there regularly. And here I am doing my Ultraman bit. This is a small statue of Ultraman just on the fringes of the Evangelion statue that is there in downtown Shanghai. This is some examples of the K-pop fan culture as it exists in Shanghai as well. Whole malls dedicated to Japanese and Korean pop culture in the heart of Shanghai, right? In the heart of what is probably one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the world, but also one that if you read this news this summer, you would picture is a lot more closed to outside cultural influences than it turns out that it is. So here we see some examples of fans who are out in public in their purple hair selling various handmade fan objects. They've rented tables at some of these malls. There are more than 400 malls in Shanghai, which is a highly capitalist city in the midst of a communist country, and that tension generates what I call pop cosmopolitans. So pop cosmopolitans are people who seek to escape the parochialism of their own culture by consuming pop culture from somewhere else. So if you have sons and daughters who love anime, love manga, listen to K-pop, right? They are pop cosmopolitans. If they listen like the Bollywood films that I started with, they're pop cosmopolitans. If they like balsa, or salsa songs from bossa nova songs from Brazil, they're pop cosmopolitan. If they like telenovelas from Mexico and Argentina or soaps from Turkey, they are part of the global shuffle that's taking place in the age of Netflix and the other global streamers. Now, when pop culture comes in, it generates conversation. When I was in Shanghai, I kept having conversations with young women about the group over there, G-Idol, who are a kind of pop feminist group from South Korea, who when they bring their music in, bring ideas about gender and the male gaze and gender androgyny, not quite non-binary, but definitely things in that direction that these Chinese women were curious about and sought out information on and debated, read about, took advantage of access to the internet, going, as they said, over or under the firewall to get access to information from the outside. So pop culture brings with it conversations. The same turns out to be true about Barbie, right? So the coverage here was Barbie crashed and burned in China. It came in 5th place behind 4 Chinese films that we could open in China. In fact, it's a more complex picture than that. The Chinese exhibitors thought it was a kid's film. They had no idea that it was a film that might appeal to adults. When these young women I was involved with in Shanghai, indulge makes it sound bad. I was studying in Shanghai, right? Those young women would say, said that when they discovered it, it was very significant to them. You can see how it aligns with the aesthetics of the K-pop that they like. But they used it to discuss questions of gender, that America Ferraro's speech, with many of my academic feminist friends shrugged about, was really important for them to open them up to ideas about feminism from the West. Pop Mart is maybe one of the most important new entrepreneurial concerns in China. It's now in 10 years old. It's in 22 countries around the world. I hear there's going to be one in LA. I'm hoping for it. But they create character goods. Molly is maybe their biggest success. Molly is the character there. Here, Molly is dressed like an astronaut. One of the things I discovered in China is the Chinese are in a space race with us. We just don't know it. They are really invested in space and the exploration of space. And if we don't get involved in this soon, we are going to be left far behind by what's going on there. So her cute pink spacesuit is part of that. You can see here she comes in lots of different colors, including Coke Red down there. The other thing so Molly is a character who doesn't yet have a franchise, but she's being developed bottom up as IP that will eventually become a major media franchise around the world. And she also is a licensee. So if you look here, there's Coke, there's SpongeBob, there's any number of things. But she cosplays as these characters. Underneath, she is a Chinese person, a Chinese citizen. On top of that, then we layer these brands from outside. And that's a good metaphor for thinking about how these young people are connecting with pop culture. Now, the Chinese government feels threatened by this and is responding with both coercive and attractive power. Coercive, they're shutting down fan fan fiction websites. They're closing off access to certain bands, certain information. But attractive, they're trying to build their own franchise. So there is a young Mao from a television drama produced by the Chinese government. We may have, those of us of a certain age will remember those plaster of Paris bust of old Mao. But young Mao appears to us in vinyl at the government issue store in Shanghai, produces these figures along the same model as Pop Mart, but are using it to sell the origin story of the Communist Party in China. But they're going back earlier than that. What the Chinese government is really focused on is historical fiction, historical serials, which are now being exported around the world, including Empresses in the Palace, which has been one of their success. That same government store is selling these vinyl pop figurines, character goods tied to that narrative. And it's part of a larger campaign of the Chinese government to take cosplay and turn it into something that's more nationalistic. So they're going back to historical costumes, what's called hanfu, and they run shops all over where you can rent the outfits, you can get your hair made, you can get your makeup put on. You're prepared, and you go out to historical sites or even just the mall dressed like figures from the past. Again, those of you who know your Chinese history, in fact, during the Cultural Revolution, Mao tried to get rid of all of these traces of earlier moments in Chinese history and culture. Chinese government are bringing it back as an attractor for young people. They're afraid they were losing to pop culture from elsewhere around the world. So let's think of the Indian example and the Chinese example as what some people have been calling narrative change. So these are just some quotes I found on the internet. Narrative is the way we tell stories of real human beings and their courageous efforts to make change in the face of systems that hold them back. Narrative change involves moving people to act on their beliefs. That's Rinko Sen, Executive Director of Narrative Initiative. Rashad Robinson, Color of Change. Narrative power is the ability to change the norms and rules that our society lives by. Narrative infrastructure is the set of systems we maintain in order to do that reliably over time. Let me shift my position. Thank you. And then finally, journalist Rohani Mohan says, I think of narrative like a song that leaves you with a feeling. It isn't just pieces of news, but something that stays with you, sits in you, and makes you think. You aren't aware that you're getting a message, but it travels through you. Now, some of these definitions make it sound like narrative change is about propaganda, top down. But it doesn't have to be. Narrative change is how we relate to stories and how we use stories as resources in our own imagination. So those little figurines that Pop Mart sells are tokens of a kind of civic imagination, a pop cultural civic imagination, which attracts the interest of these young Chinese students, and they're drawn toward a wider society beyond their national borders. And that's an important part of what's taking place. Now, many of these definitions assume narrative change is governed by news frames or information, and that's one possibility. We're going to hear today about documentaries. But it's also the case that narrative change is fueled by pop culture, by action sequences and Indian and Bollywood films, by sort of spectacle and costume and color in things like Barbie or things like the K-pop that we talked about. So this brings us to this idea of the civic imagination. For us, the civic is a cultural, social phenomenon. It's the foundation to which we return as we seek to resolve disagreements and work through tensions. It's a shared set of norms, values, commitments we make to each other as members of a community, and it's a capacity to work together toward common goals. So that's the civic. For us, that's different from the political, which has to do with partisan battles, struggles. I don't think we're going to talk much about the political here. That's probably a relief to most of us because politics has become so toxic in every possible direction. But if we're going to get out of the current moment of high divisiveness and political polarization, it's going to be the civic that gets us through it. It's going to be the capacity of neighbors to break bread together, to share faith, to share stories of their past, to come together around family and tradition. Those things bring us together. And pop culture, I want to argue, is potentially a driving force, especially for younger generations, through which civic values get transmitted. or don't get transmitted, right? It's the responsibility of the artist, the media makers, to tell the stories that will enhance our civic connections rather than detract them. So before we can create a better world, we need to imagine what a better world looks like. And here we see Wakanda, which has allowed African Americans and Africans and many others to imagine a different version of Africa than the ones that we grew up with in pop culture in the past. This is not Tarzan's domain. This is a world which is never colonized by the West, that has vast resources and knows what to do with them. It is not divided by tribal factions, that respects men and women as co-partners in building a better world, and is prepared to be a global leader. That's a kind of vision of Africa that has rallied lots of young people all over the planet. You need to imagine a process of change. What's going to change the world? What's the values driving that change? You must imagine yourself a civic agent capable of making change. So what gives us agency? What gives us the capacity to change the world? You need to imagine yourself as part of a community with shared interest, right? And you can see I'm using superheroes in all of these functions just to illustrate that these are not dependent on news or information necessarily, that pop culture can do these functions too. And for the generation I teach, and probably those of you who are educators, the generation you're teaching, superheroes is a big part of what's giving them their values and their identities. We have to forge solidarity whose groups or perspectives are different from our own. So here we can think about the Avengers, which is everything from Old Norse gods to World War II vets to, so forth, all working together, different visions of what it is to be a superhero, but allied to change the society. For those who are most oppressed, you have to imagine freedom, dignity, democracy, safety, participation before you can directly experience them. So all of those, we put it together and we have a vision of what we mean by the civic imagination. It is this capacity to rebuild democracy using pop culture as a central set of resources for doing it. So I began with the global South. I want to end with the American South. My friend Katie Barum-Chatou, who runs the Yes and Comedy Lab at American University, works with comedians to help them think about how to convey social messages through their work. And this is a Southern-based comedian who uses the persona of a professional wrestler, which I chose in honor of Sam, my host. And he talks about, in this video, racism. So if we can...
Racism, listen here real quick, you antiquated prick. It's your boy, the Buttercream Dream, and I'm coming to you today to let you know that us sane people are trying to have, like, a decent civilization and stuff, and you're sort of putting a hitch in our proverbial giddy-up. Skew! Couple things off top racism. You're old and played out. You're like a Tiger King meme on my great-aunt's Facebook wall. Only dipshits and assholes still find you appealing, and the rest of us wish that you would get shot out of a cannon into the sun. Skew! And look, the Buttercream Dream don't just mean your regular, run-of-the-mill, casual racism at parties. No, no, no! I'm calling out your whole stable. Individual racism, systemic racism, police brutality, all that horse shit.
But Buttercream Dream, I'm not racist. I just think that if black people in general...
Nope! We ain't having none of that neither. The myth of the model minority shit ain't gonna cut it, Jack. And in case you think the Buttercream Dream is being all holier than thou, please understand that I'm also wrestling with my own racism and prejudices that I unknowingly held, because that is how systemic stuff works. I know it's hard to believe, but even this 6-foot-tall, 210-pound bucket of love ain't perfect. But much like my problem with night cookies, it's something I'm actively working on. Skew! That's right. It all starts with you, pal. One thing that doesn't take too much effort is just to look inward and check out the man in the mirror. Skew!
So that is a very good example of taking a pop culture frame, in this case professional wrestling, and using it as a language to talk about social change and civic unity. And I think there's something really interesting going on in comedy right now that illustrates that process, especially the comedians that have been working with Katie to build out become more conscious of the work that they are doing. So I think the challenge then, the challenge we've given to our artists is to think more deeply, think more inwardly and intentionally about what pop culture can do, what the media arts that they're practicing can do, and how we can mobilize that together to rebuild America, right? To rebuild an America that is stronger, build back better, to use one party's terms, make it great again, to use another. But I think what we want to know is, how do we build a better world here and around the planet? How do we join forces with young people in India, China, and other parts of the world who also are seeking a better world for the future? And what causes and messages are we integrating into the stories that we tell? And with that, let me turn the table over to my longtime friend and former MIT colleague, William Uricchio, who's going to talk about the work they do.